Welcome to this episode of Game and Earn. In today's video, we're going to go over some of the top Sega games going up in value over the last 31 days. We will be looking at Sega-specific consoles such as Sega Saturn, Sega Genesis, and more, finding both loose and complete in-box games to see where you can make some profits. This video won't go too in-depth on the games themselves, but instead we'll cover reasons why it might be expensive, increasing in value, or just plain rare. With that out of the way, let's get to it and find some ways to game and earn. Starting off our list is Splatterhouse III for the Sega Genesis. As the title suggests, this is the third installment of the violent arcade-style game, and the second on the system. With one of the most badass box arts ever to be released, this iteration of the series did not disappoint when it was released in 1993. Sega was one of the major players in the console wars of the 90s, and for good reason. The advertisements and insinuations were that Sega was more for adults, whereas Nintendo was for babies. Being able to point to a title like Splatterhouse definitely pushed that narrative even further, and it resonated with a lot of gamers. Moving on to price, the loose price for Splatterhouse 3 has actually remained rather steady for the last year, hovering around $80 for a copy. However, it seems as if the title is becoming more in demand as several sales over the last 30 days have broken the $100 barrier, some even going for over $120. You can still find a bad label copy for less than $100, but a nice condition copy is going to be more in the $125 range. As of now, the good condition ones listed are at $140, but with some patience, a copy can be found for less than that. This is a sell for me, as I don't expect it to stay that high for too long, but if it did, I also wouldn't be that shocked. Another loose Sega Genesis game going up in value is a bit of an oddball in Alicia Dragoon. Before I was a collector and just a regular gamer, I had never even heard of this title until I found it in the dollar bin at a garage sale. The label looked interesting, but I had never heard of it before, and considering myself a gamer with some knowledge, I figured it was just junk. Turns out I was really wrong, and it's actually somewhat of a valuable game that often gets overlooked by people when on the hunt for Sega Genesis titles. Unlike Splatterhouse 3, Alicia Dragoon isn't valuable because it was iconic or people remember it fondly when they think back to their Sega Genesis days. Instead, the game falls into that fun game, bad sales category that so many from that era do. Alicia Dragoon didn't reinvent the wheel or try to build a universe out, but it was fun, enjoyable, and could be beat in an afternoon. As a sub $50 game prior to the pandemic, Alicia Dragoon has seen a spike as of late to now coming close to that $100 mark for a loose copy. This isn't exactly uncharted territory for the title, seeing similar peaks in June of 2021 and 2022. However, after it reached those heights, it wasn't long-lived, dropping back down to the safe Florida set around $70. This is another sell for me though, because I believe it will come back down a bit, and being a title people don't keep near and dear to their heart, it's likely the first title on the chopping block for their collection. Up next is a more expensive title, and one we'll be looking at the price of in complete in-box condition. Sparkster for the Sega Genesis. Not to be confused with Sparkster for the SNES, Sparkster for the Genesis is a sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures, also released on the same console. Releasing somewhat late in the Genesis lifecycle, Sparkster reviewed decently, but just didn't sell amazingly well. With the Sega CD already released and the Sega Saturn right around the corner, Sparkster probably wasn't as popular as it should have been. Sparkster was once a title you could find complete in box for easily under $150, only breaking into the $200 plus range since this pandemic started in early 2020. Since then, though, it has steadily increased and seems to have gained notoriety as a game that is hard to find in good, complete condition. It's now in the top 10 most valuable Sega Genesis games as of this video when complete. As for the current price, in just the last 31 days, Sparkster has increased over $60 for a complete in-box copy, from the previous price of $350 to now sitting safely above $400. However, Sparkster doesn't have an extremely strong sales volume, with roughly one sale a week over the last year. But with only one or two complete copies for sale at any given moment, this is a title I would throw into the hold column, and if it does drop back down some, I can see myself scooping it up. Moving on to some disc-based games, the first title that caught my eye was Batman Forever for the Sega Saturn. This is a classic arcade beat-em-up style game released on a few different consoles, but specifically, we're going to cover the Sega Saturn one. If you're watching this video, you probably already know that the Sega Saturn is not only an amazing console, but a console that is very, very expensive to collect for. You can blame it on the low sales or the uniquely shaped game cases, but either way, even the cheapest sports titles for the Sega Saturn are well over 20 bucks. In particular, the CIB copies of titles are hard to find in good condition because of those uniquely shaped cases and with the pretty weak hinges that are often broken. That's not to say that Saturn games aren't good, on the contrary, it has some really amazing titles, but it certainly makes it easy to explain price increases. Batman Forever is a perfect example, as this is a game that doesn't really do anything particularly well, but it didn't sell well and wasn't extremely bad. While not as expensive as its PlayStation 1 counterpart, Batman Forever on the Saturn still fetches a hefty price tag. Having routinely been around the $200 range, it dropped in recent months only to surge back with force and has been safely above $230 for the last couple of weeks. It's tough to put a sell tag on anything Sega Saturn related, but I think anytime you can get more than $240 for this title, you should take the chance. Probably one of the weirdest games to ever exist, we need to take a look at CMan for the Sega Dreamcast. This title was a virtual pet simulator style game where you had to take care of, you guessed it, a seaman. However, this isn't your average fish, as it has the body of a fish, but a face of a human. Like I said, weird. You need to take care of him and make sure he grows up. The major factor that causes the CIB prices to fluctuate is the fact that this title came with a microphone attachment, which allowed the player to speak to the seaman. Additionally, the title came with a larger box that held the game case, speaker, and adapter. Finding a complete copy with all of these is difficult, and likely why the price is increasing. Finally, the microphone had a bad habit of the pop filter deteriorating, so finding a good condition mic can be a tough task. As for the price, it fluctuates wildly depending on condition, as you would expect. You can expect to find a copy without the outer box and mic for roughly 60 bucks. But the now going price for a truly complete in-box copy is well above $100, with some of the better condition copies actually selling for close to 200 bucks. This title is an oddity that I think people will still go after in years to come. So if you can find a complete in-box copy with box and mic, I'm a buyer at anything under $100. Finally, I'd like to cover a game from the Sega CD, and one that isn't all that well known. Road Avenger for the Sega CD is a bit of an oddity because it's an interactive movie video game, filled with QuickTime events the player must press in order to succeed. This was actually a somewhat successful genre for the Sega CD and other consoles, with other titles being Night Trap, Dragon's Lair, and even Space Ace. However, one of the main reasons Sega CD games are rare or expensive is simply due to the console itself. The CD was an attachment for the Sega Genesis, meaning you had to have both a Sega Genesis and the specific attachment for your console. This was expensive, and with only just over 2 million units sold during the life cycle, it wasn't exactly well received. Throw in the fact that the attachment itself cost more than most other consoles at the time, and you have a recipe for rarity. In that regard, Road Avenger fits the mold perfectly with roughly one sale a week, which is actually on the high end for Sega CD titles. Having similar problems as the Sega Saturn titles, the CD case was brittle and uniquely shaped, which meant a lot of cases didn't make it past their first owner. As for price, this title has increased from under $100 to now sitting just above the $140 price range. This was helped largely by two sales with CIB versions going for over $150. I think that this title is rare enough to where you're going to have to hold, and if you find a nice condition copy for under $120, you should buy, as this title should only increase with time. Well, that wraps up this week's Game and Earn video for the month of November for Sega Systems. There was a ton of movement this month for loose copies, as well as some complete in-box games for the CD-based consoles. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure to like and subscribe, and feel free to drop any comments with questions or suggestions. We plan on doing monthly videos for all major systems and then some. Thanks again, and see you next time.